returning 28 wild horses into the wild. It sounds self-contradictory, but it's humanity mending its relationship with nature.
11 horses step off a cargo plane and onto a desert so barren the people who live beside it stopped calling it land. No grass, no water. Winters that crash to 40 below. It is December 1986, and the ecologist behind this, Yong Jianming, has just talked his government into releasing some of the rarest animals on Earth onto ground that every serious scientist swears will kill them within a single winter. A BBC crew flies in to film the release, then packs up and leaves after 2 days, certain they are filming a death. And then, those 11 horses do something nobody is ready for. The death sentence.
The Taklamakan Desert, China's largest desert. For decades, its sands crept outward. Homes, roads, farmland, all lost to the wind.
Because these were not ordinary horses. They were Przewalski's horses, the last truly wild horse species left on Earth, gone from this region for 17 years. The ones on that plane had been flown in from zoos in East Germany in the United States, set loose in a desert that was swallowing 3,000 square kilometers of new ground every year. And here is the part nobody talks about. These were animals that had spent their whole lives eating hay from buckets and drinking from automatic waterers. Now they faced winters of 40 below, summers of 104, and the nearest water sometimes 15 kilometers away under solid ice. Officials in Jimsar County were already drafting the statements that would explain the inevitable disaster. So why gamble 11 of the rarest animals alive on ground this dead? To answer that, you have to see what this desert had already become. A dying land.
There's nothing more significant of a free Wild West country than a herd of wild horses that's galloping across the landscape.
The Jungar Basin was not always a wasteland. For 10,000 years, wild horses roamed these steppes, and the whole ecosystem grew up around their hoofbeats. Then, in 1969, they vanished. Not slowly, completely. A Soviet survey team logged the last few hoofprints, and after that, silence. And here is what nobody saw coming. Without horses pounding the surface, the soil hardened into something researchers started calling biological concrete. Rain still fell, but instead of soaking in, it sheeted across the crust and evaporated within hours. Seeds couldn't germinate. By 1974, scientists were comparing the soil to lunar dust. The land had simply gone biologically dead. Then the desert started to move, expanding 70 kilometers per decade, swallowing grasslands and farms. Beijing was choking on dust storms that lasted for days. In 1983, a single storm dropped 43,000 tons of Yungar topsoil on the capital in under 72 hours. People 1,000 miles away were breathing in the ground from a place they had never seen. So, China fought back with everything it had. The Green Great Wall set out to plant a forest barrier, 4,500 kilometers long, across the northern frontier. But the trees drank more water than the desert could give. Water tables dropped, the trees died from the bottom up, and wells ran dry. By 1985, farm output in Xinjiang had fallen 34%, and the models said Beijing itself would be uninhabitable by 2050. Billions of trees and raw engineering muscle, and the desert was still winning, which is the exact moment one man stood up and proposed the only thing crazy enough to work. Bring them back.
Horses do not need to be ridden, you know. They don't need us. They are independent. Happy to be independent.
In 1985, an ecologist named Yong Jianming walked into a government meeting and faced a room of officials who had spent 2 decades watching trees die and wells run dry. He told them to stop. Stop fighting the desert with bulldozers and tree farms. Bring back the animal that had kept this land alive since the last ice age. Bring back the wild horse. It was, by any measure, a career-ending thing to say out loud, and the room did not love it. But the failures had been so total that within months his plan was approved, which left one question hanging over everything Yong had staked his name on. How do you teach zoo-born animals, fed by humans for 3 generations, to survive a place that was swallowing cities whole? Before I tell you what these horses actually did out there, do me a quick favor. If a story about 11 captive animals walking into a death sentence and doing the impossible is your kind of thing, hit subscribe and tap the bell. We find one every single week, because what comes next is the part nobody believed could happen. The last wild horse. Here is why Yong picked this animal. The Przewalski's horse carries 66 chromosomes instead of the 64 every domestic horse has. It's the only horse on Earth that has never been domesticated, never broken, never tamed. While we bred Arabians for speed and workhorses for muscle, this one stayed exactly as it was when our ancestors painted it on cave walls. It's a living window into the Ice Age. But by 1985, that window was nearly shut. Only about 900 existed anywhere on the planet, and every single one lived in a zoo. The whole species traced back to a dozen or so animals captured around 1900, and after the Second World War, it had crashed to 31 horses, surviving in just 2 zoos, Munich and Prague. Think about what that means. Every Przewalski's horse alive came within a breath of vanishing forever, and that there were any left to send to China was a miracle on its own. The plan ran in 3 phases. Acclimatize the imported horses at a breeding center in Jimsar, teach them to be wild again inside huge semi-wild enclosures, then release them into the Kalamyli Nature Reserve, 4,000 square kilometers of the harshest terrain in Asia. Among the first horses in those Jimsar pens was a young stallion with a clean white blaze down his face. The keepers named him Hong. Remember that name. Nature's engineers. Yang's argument was never just survival. It was that these horses would rebuild the land, and it came down to 3 things. The first is brute force. Each horse weighs 600 to 800 pounds, and when it runs, its hooves hit the ground with more force than a jackhammer, cracking soil that had set like concrete and letting water back in. But here is what a machine can't do. Horses are selective. They step around the fragile young plants and pound only the bare, dead ground. They know the difference. The second is the way they move. About 15 kilometers a day, in patterns that look random but aren't. They graze hard in one place, drift miles off, then circle back, leaving a mosaic of bare patches and short and tall grass, each pocket feeding different insects, birds, and small mammals. They aren't just eating, they're designing a patchwork. And the third one sounds almost absurd. Their manure isn't waste. It's a delivery system. Their dung carries living seeds from more than 20 plant species, and the trip through the gut boosts germination by up to 300% as stomach acids crack seed coats that would otherwise stay locked for years. Every pile is a pre-fertilized seed packet scattered across 15 kilometers a day. That was the theory. Here is the problem. These horses had spent 3 to 4 generations behind bars. They didn't know how to find water in a desert, and they didn't know a wolf was something to fear. They had lost what researchers call the culture of survival, the knowledge a mother passes to her foal that no genetics can replace. So the whole project came down to one question. Had captivity killed the instinct in these animals, or was it still in there, buried, waiting? A killer winter. The first months nearly proved every critic right. Then came the first winter, and it was apocalyptic. Temperatures fell to 42 below. The horses' manes froze into ridges of ice so thick some couldn't lift their heads. Snow buried what little grass there was under 3 feet of powder. Yang's team could only watch through binoculars, forbidden to step in unless the whole herd was about to die. 7 horses got severe frostbite. 2 mares miscarried, and Yang, by his own later account, was bracing for the failure that would prove every scientist who had called him a fool exactly right. And then something nobody had scripted started to happen. The stallions began smashing the ice with their hooves to reach the water underneath, a behavior never once seen in any zoo. The mares pulled their foals into protective rings during storms, rotating positions when one got too cold. They dug through snow for buried grass and read the wind, learning which slopes had been swept clear and which had banked deep. They weren't just surviving. They were remembering. 3 generations of zoo life hadn't erased what was written in their bones, and the desert was dragging it back out, and what it woke would start to change the land itself. The desert wakes. By the spring of 1987, the change outran every projection. Grass not seen for 17 years sprouted where the horses had grazed, and biomass on grazed ground jumped 43% over untouched land. The horses weren't destroying the basin, they were waking it up. Then the soil itself began to change. Moisture retention rose 23%, not from extra rain, but because those hooves had punched roughly 10,000 tiny craters into every hectare, each a little reservoir catching water that used to evaporate. Here is the part nobody talks about. The manure was reintroducing gut bacteria the soil had been missing for decades, and by the 3rd year, 22 plant species had returned from seeds dormant for nearly 20 years. The basin had never been dead. It had been sleeping, and once the plants came back, everything followed. Dung beetles returned by the millions. 43 insect species reappeared. The insects pulled in the birds pulled in the small mammals, and then the predators came back, foxes and eagles, and the occasional gray wolf caught on a camera trap. The basin was alive again, which left Yang's team staring at a decision that would have sounded insane a decade earlier. Take the fences down. Day 8. By the late 90s, the herd in the basin had recovered enough to do exactly that. In August 2001, 27 horses were released into the open Kalamaili Reserve. No fences, no feeding, no human help of any kind. Among them was Hong, fully grown now, leading his own band. For the first week, the horses stayed within 500 meters of the release point, circling nervously. And then came day 8. Just after dawn, the monitoring team was half watching the screen out of habit when one dot started moving. Then the dots around it started moving. Hong was on his feet and his band was falling in behind him. He didn't drift or graze. He walked north in a dead straight line, like he knew exactly where he was going. 5 kilometers, 10, 15. By the time he stopped, he had led his band 30 kilometers north to a water source that appeared on none of the project's maps. Nobody had told him it was there. No horse in his bloodline had walked that route in his lifetime. He simply knew. The team drove out the next morning and found it. A half-frozen, spring-fed pool tucked against a low ridge. Hong standing beside it like he had been visiting his whole life. How he knew is still one of the great unsolved mysteries of the operation. Within a month, the horses had carved out territories. Foals born in the wild could tell 23 plant species apart by smell and froze instantly at the shadow of an eagle. And the water table, which had dropped 3 centimeters every year since 1970, stabilized in 2003. Then it began to rise. The horses had switched a hydrological pump back on after a generation in the off position. And when economists finally tried to price what these animals were doing, the number stopped them cold. The real number. What happened in the Yungar Basin broke everything China thought it knew about fighting deserts. By 2010, the country had planted 66 billion trees at a cost of $47 billion. And in many places, those trees made it worse, drinking the ground drier than rain could refill. The horses did the opposite. Their hooves opened the soil so rare rain could sink in, and their grazing kept grassland alive. And grassland needs a fraction of the water a forest does. Then someone did the math, and it stopped sounding like ecology and started sounding like economics. Per horse, per year. Soil restoration valued at $12,000. Seed dispersal at 8. Water retention at 15. Carbon at 7. Biodiversity at 5. $47,000 a horse, every single year. Think about what that means at scale. By 2023, those 11 horses had become 534, managing 26,700 hectares and generating around $25 million a year. And that was the conservative figure. The model spread fast. Mongolia released horses into Hustai National Park in 1992. Kazakhstan launched its own steppe project. Each one proved the same stubborn point. You cannot engineer an ecosystem from the top down with concrete and human design. You restore it from the bottom up, with a solution evolution already spent thousands of years perfecting. China now aims for 2,500 wild horses by 2040, enough, the models say, to bring back more than 100,000 hectares of dead land. But the real lesson here was never about horses at all. The forgotten recipe. Because the 11 animals that walked off that cargo plane in 1986 weren't just endangered creatures being relocated, they were a piece of biological technology refined by evolution over hundreds of thousands of years, capable of designing and maintaining an entire landscape on their own. We never had to build the solution. We just had to remember how to switch it on and let the experts, the ones with hooves, take over. And that leaves an uncomfortable question hanging over all of us. How many of the disasters we are throwing trillions of dollars at right now could be solved instead by bringing back the engineers we wiped out, the bison that built the American prairie, the wolves that keep Europe's forests in balance, the elephants that garden the savannas of Africa? Nature had already engineered the answer. We killed it, and then we forgot the recipe. So here's my question for you. If you could bring back one extinct ecosystem engineer anywhere on Earth to heal land we have ruined, which one would you choose and why? Drop it in the comments, because I read every single one. And if you want more stories about the animals that have quietly reshaped entire continents, that subscribe button is your next click. The next one we are working on might be the wildest yet.